Welcome everyone to the Spring 2021 series of core conversations of the Association of Core Texts and Courses. I am Charlie Thomas, Executive Director of ACTC, and I'm joined here today by our first speaker of this Spring 2021 series, Joseph Knippenberg. First, let me tell you just a little bit about ACTC in case our association is new to you. We are an international professional liberal arts organization dedicated to fostering the use of core texts, which is world classics and other texts of major cultural significance, in undergraduate education and supporting courses that encourage engagement with those texts. Like everyone else in the United States right now, we have not been able to meet, as is our typical practice. And so we developed this series, Core Conversations, in order to stay connected and keep the conversation going until we can meet again. I will say that ACTC will have an online version of our annual meeting this year. And if you go to our website, coretext.org, you can get lots of information about that. There will be many excellent panels, plenaries, and everyone's welcome. And we've made it pretty inexpensive, so we hope it'll be something that that many of you will be interested in joining us for. But to our speaker today, Professor Joseph Knippenberg is a professor of politics at Oglethorpe University and a member of the board of directors of ACTC. There are many more things I could tell you about my friend Joe, who I've known for many years, but perhaps we should leave it at that and let him have the time to talk to us about one of his favorite core texts today, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Charlie, for the generous introduction. And I want to second everything Charlie has said about ACTC. I love the organization. It's my favorite professional organization. I really miss seeing all my friends and colleagues in person at meetings. We all know that online and Zoom is a second best, but it certainly beats just staring at my screen without seeing other people stare back at me. So thank you again for this opportunity. What I'm going to do today is do the kind of thing I would be doing at an ACTC conference, and I'll just describe my own sort of approach to ACTC. I teach in a core curriculum at Oglethorpe, and this winter scene behind me is not actually what it's like now. It's just my generic winter backdrop. It's a pretty campus in the winter. We probably won't see much of it with snow this year, and I have to say that the way in which we've all adapted to Zoom is going to destroy one of the great pleasures of undergraduate life. There will be no more snow days. It will become Zoom days. But anyway, what I do when I teach, when I prepare for an ACTC conference, is I look at a class that I thought, this one seemed interesting to me and maybe even to some of my students. And so let me try to work it up into something a little more formal. And what I'm doing today is taking something I do in the first semester of our sophomore core course, which is basically great books in social and political thought from ancient to early modern, or more in particular from Aristotle to Locke. And I spent part of a class talking about Nicomachean Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 3, where Aristotle quite famously says the young are not good students, shouldn't be students of politics, which is calculated in some way, or I certainly expect it to. It has on occasion, irritated and offended my students. So what I want to do today is try to come to grips with why Aristotle thinks the young are not good students of politics, and then offer a couple of counterpoint responses. Now, I've called this Aristotle's Discourse Against Method, And that's in part because I think that in some ways, especially the early modern response to Aristotle is precisely method as the great equalizer. If the young can't have the same experience we old folks, or I'll speak for myself, this old guy has, the young can learn a method. And certainly in higher education today, one of the great ways in which we sell higher education, and especially liberal education, is to talk about a particular method. Now, the method goes by the name critical thinking, which is a kind of content-free way, but it's, everyone can learn to think critically, and it's a method that can be applied to any subject. And if you're a critical thinker, you can apply that method to, anything you come up with. And I'm a kind of critical thinking skeptic. I think critically about critical thinking, and I think Aristotle's on my side there. And so what I try to do, or what I did in the class, and I'm going to try to do a little bit in this relatively informal talk, is look at what Aristotle has to say, and then develop a couple of points from Hobbes and Locke, different kinds of, you might say, methodological counterpoints to Aristotle's deprecation of the young as students of politics. And I don't think there's any resolution, but the point of this is not to wrap it all up in a neat little bow, but rather to indicate, and certainly to try to indicate to my students what what's at stake here and what some of the alternatives are. So to begin, let me just read you from my dog-eared copy of the Nicomachean Ethics, the so to speak, controversial passage. Aristotle says, and this is in Ethics, Book 1, Chapter 3, each person judges nobly the things he knows, and of these he is a good judge. He is a good judge of a particular thing, therefore, if he has been educated with a view to it, but is a good judge simply if he has been educated about everything. Hence, of the political art, a young person is not an appropriate student, for he is inexperienced in the actions pertaining to life, and the arguments are based on these actions and concern them. So this is, the opening salvo of Aristotle's claim that the young are not good students of the political art. He goes on to say, further, the young are led by their passions. Now, he says it's not only the young that are led by their passions. When I taught this class in the fall, one of the sort of snide asides I made in talking about people who are not good students of politics or the political art because they're led by their passions was a reference to the man who will be president for just a couple more days. And I'm sure that got a few titters of appreciation from my virtual audience. So Aristotle says the young are not good students of politics because they lack experience. Now, why is experience so important? And he does this in the context of a discussion of what it is to be a good judge of thing. And the interesting thing there is he says he talks not so much about experience, but about education. But prior to talking about it, to making that point, he makes another point, which is to say, politics is all about talking about things like the good, the noble, and the just. And he says we shouldn't demand the same sort of precision in conversations about the good, the noble, and just as we do about other things. So, and again, quoting from Aristotle, it belongs to an educated person to seek out precision in each genus to the extent that the nature of the matter allows. To accept persuasive speech from a skilled mathematician appears comparable to demanding demonstrations from a skilled rhetorician. What we want in mathematics is a kind of mathematical certainty. What we want in politics is plausibility. This works in a lot of cases, not necessarily in every case, or it's true in a lot of cases, but not necessarily in every case. We don't demand certainty in politics the way we do in let's say, mathematics. Now, the implication here, I think, is that the young, because they don't understand quite the difference between mathematics and politics, between discussions of the definitions of a triangle and the good, they can't really appreciate why there is some ambiguity or just a kind of appropriate level of generality in political discussions when there's certainty elsewhere. I mean, I certainly have this difficulty with my students. They want, a lot of times, they're really uncomfortable with, let's say, one state having one sort of law about something and another state having another sort of law about something. The law should be the same for everyone everywhere. That's what justice is. No room for local, regional, or cultural variation. Now, not every student says this, but I think that's a kind of general assumption that the law should be national, international, or global laws. They shouldn't be particularized. At least that's one line of argument that I often get. So Aristotle then, to repeat myself, Aristotle says the young lack experience, and so they're not good judges of politics. They don't know what the appropriate level of certainty that should be applied to questions of the good, the just, and so on. And the implication is they should listen to me because I have experience. They'll gain that experience, or some of them may gain that experience. Depends on how much they're led by their passions, I suppose. At least one of the things it depends on is that. But the young should defer to those who have the experience and know, I've been around the block a few times and know kind of what you should expect. Now, I don't expect them to be happy with this. I don't expect them to agree with me. And so I say, well, what's the argument against it? Well, the argument against it, at least in the context of the class I teach, is to be found in early modern political thought. I don't teach, I don't assign Machiavelli's Prince, but obviously in the Prince, there is the famous or infamous celebration of the audacity of the young in chapter 25. The discourses, as I recall, is dedicated to young men. Machiavelli is the first, great celebrator of the political efficacy of the young. Hobbes and Locke aren't quite as explicit, but I do think that both of them offer lines of argument that could be profitably, in this respect, juxtaposed to Aristotle's, case on behalf of old farts like me. I emphasize a kind of artificial distinction between Hobbes and Locke in this regard. I think they're a lot closer, but the tenets of the arguments of their arguments look a little bit different, and so I think I can point to two different kinds of more egalitarian, more youth-oriented approaches that one can find in those. Now, Hobbes is famous, I think, for his emphasis on mathematics and geometry. If everything is matter in motion, then certainly you can use mathematics and geometry to make sense of matter in motion, and it becomes a method that can be profitably be applied to the world in which we live. And he says, and this is, I also have a dog-eared copy of Leviathan with me in chapter 46 of Leviathan, right at the beginning. Second one here. He says, by philosophy is understood the knowledge acquired from the reasoning, acquired by reasoning from the manner of the generation of anything to the properties, or from the properties to some possible way of generation of the same, to the end to be able to produce, as far as matter and human force permit, such effects as human life requireth. We don't need experience if we have this method, because we can make anything happen. And I think everyone can see that people are at the peak of their mathematical powers when they're young, as opposed to when they're older, like me. So if you have this method, you can impose what order you will on nature. You don't have to be guided by experience. You can just use the method to create whatever effect you want. So you can say, let's call it generally the scientific method, which anyone can understand who has reason, becomes one kind of equalizer. If politics or the political art is really political science, and political science is really mathematical, then a very smart 18-year-old can be just as much a political scientist, so to speak, as I am, I in my 60s. The argument from Locke is a little bit different. And again, I'm sort of artificially emphasizing the difference or making it bigger than it really is in fact. And my students get this right away. Hobbes and Locke begins the second treatise by talking about how human beings are by nature free and equal. So we have two, let's call them abstract moral principles, the principle of equality, the principle of freedom. And you can apply those moral principles to the world. And they don't have to be, you might say, well, the application has to be informed by experience. But my students are very, very comfortable insisting upon, let's say, the principle of equality, or in some contexts, the principle of freedom. Equality more than freedom for reasons that I think Oprah explains. And someone's claim that, well, that's never really worked that way. Doesn't hold much water for them. It's the moral principle swallows everything. So I suggest to them that there are two kinds of responses to Aristotle's defense of old guys and his deprecation of the political judgment of the young. And one is science, the other is abstract moral principle. Now, I suppose I could leave it at that, and they would all embrace some version of Hobbes or Locke, or some hypertrophied version of Hobbes or Locke. Mostly, I think, as I suggested, right now the burden of student opinion seems to favor equality above everything else. But I suggest that that may not go quite far enough, and that Aristotle has a response to these methodological responses to his claim on behalf of experience. And it is to go back to experience. And in some ways, the arguments on behalf of method are arguments on behalf of method deployed on behalf of whatever passion we happen to hold. And so, as Hobbes says, and I think it's chapter 8 of Leviathan, the thoughts are to the passions as scouts and spies to find the way abroad to the thing desired. And I could almost deploy Locke against Hobbes, because and anyone who's and Charlie may appreciate this if she was particularly well educated, as I'm sure she was in philosophy. There's the whole debate in certainly in Anglo-American philosophy between ought and can. The old, and in some ways, Hobbes is a representative of the ought school, and Locke more of the of the can school, and Locke more of the ought school. If you accept these caricatures of freedom and equality on the one side and method on the other. So but both the ought and the can, as represented by Locke and Hobbes here, are deployed on behalf of passions, and the dispute between them can't be resolved because they're all just representative of particular passions. So the question does come back to the question of the passions. And Aristotle would say to them, we learn by our experience that passions can lead us astray. Now, he disposes of it in a couple of different ways in the Ethics later on in book 1. One way is just kind of insult. experiences. People who are led by their passions and identify happiness with pleasure are, leading a life of cattle. And that is calculated to appeal to a certain kind of audience. It's rumored, or there's a story that Winston Churchill once read the Nicomachean Ethics and didn't see what all the fuss was about. It just seemed to be common sense. Yeah, Winston Churchill, but he's one of those old guys with a lot of the right kind of experience. But I think all of us, and I think even my students, having had the sad experience of a couple of years of a certain kind of student life, that passions don't necessarily produce human thriving. You follow a passion, and you might end up with a really bad hangover the next day. They understand that passion isn't necessarily a good guide to conduct, and they'll learn more and more about that over time. And so Aristotle would say, I think, that in some ways, our experience is acquired through a kind of, let's call it, dialectical interaction between our passions and our reason, which we share with others. We don't just take the passions for granted. No one in his or her right mind simply takes the passion for granted. You can make yourself do so. Hobbes, for the sake of his argument, has to claim that all there really is passion. So for Hobbes, deliberation is just a succession of passions. Aristotle would say deliberation is thinking about your experience, talking about your experience with other people. And our experience is, you might say, passions interacting with reason in a context in which lots of people are talking. And so, I could, the claim I would make on Aristotle's behalf is that there is this kind of pre-philosophic acquisition of experience that occurs in every cultural context. Now, if any of you are readers of C.S. Lewis, and especially The Abolition of Man, you can say you might be able to see Lewis's discussion of education in The Abolition of Man lurking in the background here. I think it does, and I think Lewis gets, in a lot of ways, the practical parts of it quite right. Lewis describes education as old birds teaching young birds to fly. And in a sense, that's a very Aristotelian statement. And Lewis also very colorfully refers to people who basically would just apply method. He calls them two different things, and they're insults. He calls them urban blockheads and trouser apes. So I don't, I leave my students with all of this, and I don't want to resolve the question for them. I just want them to get this experience that figuring out how to conduct your life is a very complicated undertaking. And however appealing, one argument might be, there are always good arguments on the other side. So, Churchill probably shouldn't have just said he didn't see what all the fuss was about. But my students also shouldn't just sign on to the latest, crusade on behalf of some abstract principle. So that's what I try to do in class, and I happen to think best and most clearly to the degree that I can think clearly at all when I write it down. So this is what I do have a kind of modest little paper about this, which I will probably end up submitting as a proposal to the online conference. But that's what I do, and I encourage all of you out there, as you teach, to keep in mind and keep a list of, hey, this class went really well. If a class went really well, it's probably a darn good paper for ACTC. And I would encourage you, when the time comes, to look at the website, look at the call for papers, and write it up these papers are really easy to write up, and I promise you, I won't. I don't have the experience of the online conference to go. I promise you, the in-person experience of delivering such a paper is always rewarding. So with that, I will stop what I have to say here.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, we're going to do our best to make the online experience as close to the in-person experience as we can, knowing that we can't quite get there, but we're going to try. And thank you so much for your talk, and also for plugging the conference. Again, for those of you who don't have experience with ACTC conferences, one of the things we do is insist that your papers are short, and also organize panels that have a lot of time. So up to half of the session is left for conversation and real exchange and discussion, rather than just a very short Q&A at the end of a session, as many conferences do. This series, Core Conversations, is different, but we've constructed this to emphasize conversation too. So the most important thing for me to say, other than thank you, which I will say several times to Joe, is that we would love for you to join us online on Zoom. The link will be available on the website where you found this video on February 5th at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. Where Professor Knippenberg will be available to take your questions and have a bit of conversation about Nicomachean ethics, Hobbes, Locke, experience, education, Lewis. We have a rich field to explore together on February 5th at 10 a.m. But I have the good fortune of being here now, and I'd like to ask you one question, if that's okay, Joe. You
Sure.
game for a question? Okay, good. So I share with you your skepticism of critical thinking. I've taught many critical thinking and logic and language classes, and I find a lot of value in that. And at the same time, I think that it kind of has a place in contemporary discourse that might not be quite right. But speaking to your argument about the importance of experience in education, and imagining the scenario that you set up with a young person who lacks experience, but who wants to develop judgment about the true, the good, the beautiful, etc. And because of that, perhaps is not ready to go the route of Hobbes or Locke and rely simply on method, but believes that it's important to listen to people who have the experience that they lack. When you find yourself in a world where people of experience differ so deeply and drastically on what their experience teaches them, what kind of resources does Aristotle suggest, do you suggest, for discerning whose experience to allow to be formative of your own? And I know this is an extraordinarily big question, but I think it's an important one right now. And if you could just begin to answer it, obviously we can continue to talk about it on February 5th, but I am interested because even if one believes that one lacks experience and needs to defer to those who have experience, when you're surrounded by people whose experience seems to show them different things, maybe we need some sort of method for discernment. Maybe we need something else. But I wonder again, what resources you think Aristotle offers to someone in that situation, and what you think.
Well, I remember sitting in on a graduate seminar when I had the great fortune of having a postdoc about 3 years into my career at Oglethorpe, and I spent the year up at Boston College, and sort of getting to know people that I knew by reputation but didn't know well. And there was a a seminar on Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics led by Christopher Bruhl and Ernest Fortin. And one of the things that they did in the seminar was recommend biographies to be read along with the text. And one of the biographies they recommended was Lord Charnwood's biography of Lincoln. Another was Winston Churchill's biography of the Duke of Marlborough, his great ancestor. I'm not suggesting that everyone's experience is equally good. I mean, that would be a very unaristotelian thing to say. And you might say one of the problems with our experience today is that it is inescapably, what word should I use? I could use two words, one of which is particularly appropriate for our COVID time, which is our experience is inescapably infected with method. We all, and Aristotle would concede that it is. Because our experience is not just sense data, it is sense data about which we talk. And our talk is colored by our culture. And our culture is certainly colored by, you might say that certainly in the 21st century, the scientific method. I live in a neighborhood in Atlanta where there are still signs out, the very common sort of COVID sign. In this house, we believe in, among other things, science. So yeah, I mean, I would want people to recognize that experience is always, the other word, if this were simple, if we were just talking in a pre-COVID era, it's polluted by method. So it's infected, polluted. It's mediated by, informed by, all these words you can use. And there is no experience that isn't, in some sense, an ideologized experience today. So one of the things that you have to do is come to recognize that, and you recognize that by, and Aristotle would say, having the experience that people disagree, and he says in the politics of the dispute between the Democrats and the oligarchs, each get part of it right. The Democrats insist upon equality, and the oligarchs insist upon inequality. And he says they're both partly right. It is equality, but equality for equals. And it is inequality, but inequality for unequals. So part of what people have to do is recognize that the particular horizon in which they operate is an horizon informed by a particular ideology. And you have to recognize there are a variety of ideologies, if you will, or a variety of points of view. And my students at Oglethorpe don't like the fact that they're required to take all these classes. They would rather just take what they want to take. They regard courses as obstacles. I got to get this class out of the way. But I think in some sense, required courses where students are required to confront ideas that they don't like and with which they may disagree, show them, I think, properly, not that there is just a multiplicity of equally valid points of view. Aristotle rejects that argument in 1.3 in the Ethics. But that there is more than one point of view. And there are good arguments on all the sides. So classes like the classes that are offered in core curricula are, one antidote. Another, and it's not just reading philosophy, reading political philosophy. It's also reading literature, and especially literature that introduces you to. I used to say back in the old day, you read novels and plays and so on, so you meet people you wouldn't meet at the mall. I can't say that, we don't go to the mall anymore. You meet people you wouldn't meet online. Most of us probably couldn't meet a Caesar or a Napoleon online, or St. Augustine. So I love reading novels, and I recommend novels to my and plays to my students because they will encounter human beings are very different from the ones they're likely to encounter in their daily experience. So I do think, and I'm with Aristotle here, that it requires a kind of education. It's an education that people don't naturally, there are few people, I suppose, who seek it naturally. Most people have to be made to acquire the taste for it. And the more that taste is cultivated, the ideal opportunity to cultivate it is in undergraduate education in schools that have core curricula. The better they should be at making good common sense of their experience. The more inoculated they will be, again, a COVID term, against pardon my expression, dumb ideology. So that's my short answer is, get a liberal education.
I love that answer. Of course, we have much more to talk about. And I hope, yeah, me too, very much. So everyone out there watching this, please join us on February 5th. We have several more core conversations scheduled for this semester. Information on the ACTC website, coretexts.org. We've got the conference coming up in April. We have a lot going on. We look forward to having good conversation with you. Thanks again, Joe.
Thank you.
See you soon, everybody.
See you.
Bye.